So welcome everyone to the week 3 roundup of the January-February 2019 run of this course on Jane Austen, Myth, Reality and Global Celebrity. I'm sitting here at the University of Southampton. I'm Gillian. This is Kim Simpson.
Hello.
And I'm feeling a little bit like Mr. Woodhouse, fearful about the snow that's falling down outside. Nothing like the participants who are living in the Midwest in the United States, but frightening enough for a British person.
Absolutely.
So there are some things that we wanted to talk about this week. I mean, we're going to try and give you a week 3 roundup, but of course there are themes that have been running through the entire course, and we want to address some of those with you. First, thank you for your comments. As always, we've got some really engaged participants, and it's delightful to see the interaction between you as well as the interaction with us as educators and with Amy and Alison, who've been doing such a marvellous job on the boards throughout this course. But Kim, I know one of the things that you really wanted to address was this sort of question of canon and question of how Jane Austen became Jane Austen, the preeminent writer, novelist of the age.
So I suppose when we're talking about myth, one of the myths that I come up against over and over again is this idea that actually there weren't any women writers doing anything really before Austen. And it's an idea that seems remarkably persistent despite the fact that there were a lot of women writers right back into the kind of late 17th century. So we start with people like Aphra Behn and Mary Astell through to Eliza Haywood, and then we have mid-century writers like Charlotte Lennox, Sarah Fielding, and then of course the later 18th century writers who there's more of a kind of direct influence perhaps on Austen. So people like Frances Burney, Mary Brunton.
Yes, of course.
And so there's this whole kind of wealth of women writers who, outside of the academy, are not widely recognised even today. And I think when you're sort of in the academic world, you tend to kind of imagine that everybody knows about these writers, but actually a lot of people don't. And I guess one of the things that fascinates a lot of feminist scholars of the period is this question of, well, why? What happened to these writers? Because it's not that they were having a really, really difficult time and unable to kind of participate. They were participating in the literary arena. They were writing novels. Some of them were writing poetry. So you have somebody like Charlotte Smith, for example, who has a real influence on William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Absolutely.
But until 20 years ago, probably, Charlotte Smith wouldn't have appeared on a Romanticism course.
No.
So I suppose the question is, what happened really? And there are a number of different responses, one of which is to say, well, you know, these writers just kind of weren't really very good. And I think, I mean, that is the case for some of these women writers.
It's also the case for some of the men.
Exactly.
All of Wordsworth is not as wonderful as one would hope it to be.
Yes.
I mean, I think, and when there's been some comments on the board about, well, you know, they haven't stood the test of time. Well, not everything that Wordsworth wrote has stood the test of time, and yet he's a firmly established canonical poet of Austen's period.
Yeah, so I suppose it kind of, it leads us to a question, well, how do we make the canon, and what do we think of as value, really, I guess?
Yes.
And so I suppose you've got somebody like Ian Watt, who comes along in the 60s and says, okay, well, formal realism is kind of developed in the novel by people like Richardson, Fielding, and I think Defoe as well, doesn't he say?
Yeah, the great triumvirate.
Exactly. Not kind of really paying attention to the fact that Richardson, Fielding and Defoe were very influenced by the women writers of their time too. So there's this kind of dialogue which gets forgotten. And then I guess there's also this question of value itself. So, you know, should we really be thinking of value as a formal thing, or as to do with realism, or are there other kind of types of value that we might, that we might discuss? So things like, you know, can reading a woman writer of the time teach us something about innovation with form, with experimentation with different types of literary forms, or can they tell us something about what it was like to be a woman at the time?
Sure.
So there are all these other kind of ways, I think, that we can think about value, which in the late 18th century and in the Victorian era just weren't really thought about. And so
That's
these
right,
women
yeah.
writers just get
Yeah.
left out.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up Ian Watt there as well, Kim, in terms of the great rise of the novel debate, because something that we've been thinking a lot about this week is questions of national perspectives and how different things look from different nations. And it's wonderful to have so many nations represented on the course, actually, people who've read Austen in many, many different translations. And that brings me back to one of the stories of the novel that I work on myself directly, and I think is a myth, that the novel is a peculiarly British development in the 18th century, because it is not. And one of the very greatest writers of the 1740s, and this is a pan-European writer, is a woman called Françoise de Graffigny, whose Lettres d'une Péruvienne, so Letters of a Peruvian Woman, was the bestseller of 1747 and had many, many editions and translations and continuations of her work, hugely popular in Britain. And who remembers her now? And actually, to say that she's not remembered now because she isn't very good is not true. I recommend her to you highly. Her novel is available in a modern English edition, and it's a really great read. So I think when we're thinking about what the novel's doing, how it's developing in that period, French fiction is important. And that brings us quite neatly on to Isabelle de Montolieu, who I think some of you are very surprised at her reworking of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. And you are, of course, right to be surprised. It's when we think of translation now, we're looking for fidelity, we're looking for something that transposes the original English into a new language. But Isabelle de Montolieu didn't care about Jane Austen's original English. She didn't know who Jane Austen was. She was interested in reworking that narrative as a creative original to suit the horizon of expectations of her own first readers in France.
Which I think, I mean, it says something really interesting, doesn't it, about where people are placing value. So she's looking at the plot rather than at a developed kind of author.
Absolutely.
And I think other authors, earlier in the period are using their name, but actually increasingly it seems like the plot does become a kind of more interesting thing to translators who are looking at the work for what they can turn it into rather than what they can kind of market it as, by this particular person.
Yeah, quite right. And I think, the point is made in the course, and I hope you've all watched the video when I interview Professor Bourg at the Sorbonne about this. And Montolieu is herself a brand in the period. Hers is the name that's going to sell books. She's the pan-European celebrity. Jane Austen is simply another British writer with whom she can work. And I think it's always really gratifying to see people on the boards engaging with, wow, I didn't know that that fiction was translated so quickly, and why is Jane Austen on Paris bookshelves? Well, because lots of British authors were. This is not about Jane Austen being good. This is about a market for British fiction that existed in France that pre and post dates the publication of Jane Austen's novels.
And I think, we do tend to be very kind of Anglo-centric, and to think about only English writers. It's interesting that there are now translations of other writers. I'm thinking particularly about the exhibition that we put on at Chawton a couple of years ago, which was about Germaine de Stael, who's another writer that Gillian works on.
Yes, absolutely, and well worth reading again. Another one of these very famous literary celebrities in the early 1900s. Lord Byron writes a poem about her, and her novels are very, very good. But who's reading them now? She is still in print, but she's not a household name in the way that Jane Austen is a household name.
So again, there's this question about, well, how do these reputations get made, and how do these people just kind of fall out of recognition? And I do think it's something to do with posthumous kind of the posthumous shaping of reputations, which I think we looked at in week 2, didn't we, when we talked about Jane Austen's biography and how she was kind of remade as a kind of as a sort of perfect Victorian kind of woman, or at least with proto-Victorian values.
That's right, and I think what I like about this course and what I like about watching your engagement with it is when people come to the realization that actually in terms of what we know about Jane Austen. There are so many gaps, and that makes her very ripe for applying our own readings to both her novels and her life. And it's always very interesting for us to watch you do that.
But that's, I mean, it's something that's kind of come up on the boards as well. People saying, well, is it all right to apply a kind of, you know, a post-colonial lens or something very modern, a very modern kind of reading of Austen? Is it okay to look at Austen through a feminist lens, or is it kind of forcing a reading that didn't exist there?
Yeah.
But I think even Austen herself, some people argue that Austen's a very conservative writer, others argue that Austen's a radical, and I think she leaves us the space to kind of do that. So actually those readings are really important in providing all these different kind of interpretations of a single text, and I think it's partly what makes her so ripe for adaptation too. The silences and the spaces that she leaves us to kind of fill in.
And you're right to point out these sort of diametrically opposed perspectives. I mean, one cannot be radical and conservative. One cannot be feminist and anti-feminist. But those readings are applied to her, and they can be convincing.
I think are persuasive on either side, actually. I mean, it certainly came out in the discussions about Mansfield Park, which I do think is a really interesting novel from that perspective, because it does kind of tick a lot of boxes. And, you know, there's the whole kind of, was Austen kind of signalling an anti-slavery position in this novel, but at the same time, you know, she's arguing against certain types of modernity that we see exemplified by the Crawfords, for example. So I think that there is this kind of real complexity actually in the novels, which these sorts of readings informed by modern theory can do a lot to kind of draw out, even if some of them are slightly less convincing, and if some of the adaptations are slightly more irreverent, should I say.
Ultimately, I think it is an engagement with character, isn't it? I mean, I talked at the Lifelong Learning Day that we held at Southampton last Saturday, which I know a very few of you were at, and it was lovely to see you there. I talked about her wonderful dialogue that makes her very ripe for adaptation, because one can lift entire passages out of the novel and put them on screen, and it's Austen's language, it's Austen's word, and there are not so many authors for whom one can do that, for whom the dialogue is written as if for the screen. So she's very rewarding in that way. But it's also about the characters, isn't it? I mean, not necessarily the main protagonists, not necessarily the Emmas and the Knightleys, but the Mrs. Eltons and the Mr. Woodhouses and those minor characters that are so very, very rounded. And Austen's rounded characters, as opposed to perhaps the flat characters of Dickens, is something that's been a recurring theme through this run of the course, that we can imagine these characters, we know characters like them. So adaptation, I think, has worked very well from that point of view.
But also as a kind of way into Austen as well, I think.
Sure.
When I teach students, a lot of them have come to the adaptations first, and I'm sure for probably the majority of Austen's readers, actually, they would have come through an adaptation or a translation at the time. If we think of Austen as a kind of global celebrity and what Austen means in different countries.
So they've got that mediating perspective that she's being mediated either by the translators or by the actors or by the directors or by the producers, and that's sort of fascinating. It's very rare for us to have that mediated approach to an author.
But it also just means that the real Jane Austen is obscured, I suppose. And there are sort of different ways to approach that. And I think it is something we've tried to kind of do in the course, to discuss all of the kind of myths around Austen as well as what we actually know.
Definitely. And I think, I mean, there are lots of ways that we can take this forward as you leave the course. I think one of the really fruitful ways that adaptations have worked in recent years is by imagining characters having a life outside of the novel. So wonderful play that I saw just a few months ago ago was ostensibly The Watsons, which, as you all know, is Jane Austen's unfinished novel. But of course, it wasn't The Watsons at all. The Watsons is a few short pages. Nobody knows what's going to happen to these characters. And the playwright Laura Wade wrote an absolutely wonderful play that took the Watsons as a starting point, but went in all kinds of new directions. So it's that creative original. It's what Isabelle de Montalieu was doing way back during Austen's own lifetime, and playwrights and script writers and directors and actresses and actors themselves are doing today with those characters.
Well, I know Sanditon was has the end of Sanditon has been written several times. I think.
Yes, absolutely. And Andrew Davies is currently at work writing it into I think something like a 12-parter for the BBC.
Excellent.
So it's going to be fascinating to see how he makes that very, very short unfinished novel into the kind of Sunday night TV drama for which the BBC is famous worldwide.
But the very short novel, but such a rich novel as well, you know, particularly in terms of reading, when we think about Jane Austen and reading and the description of the library, and he's been reading too much Richardson, which always makes me laugh.
Yes, one can easily read too much Richardson, I'm afraid.
Although
canonical though he may be.
Indeed. Although he was Austen's favourite writer, apparently.
Apparently, according to her brothers, but we know not to trust them. So anyway, we hope that you have enjoyed this course. The boards are going to be open for 5 weeks from when you signed up. So you know you can keep dipping in, you can keep commenting, you can keep interacting with each other. I'll pop in every now and then when teaching and my sort of full-time job permits. It's always great to see you engaging with this material and very gratifying to see that people are enjoying it. So thank you for that. The course will run again. I think another twice this year. We don't have exact dates yet, but keep an eye on the Future Learn site and you will see that. And one possibility, of course, that's open to you is upgrading, and that means you have permanent access to the material. Is there anything else that we need to say to people today, Kim?
I don't think so. Other than if you're in, come and see us and come and say
Absolutely,
hello. It'd be lovely to
absolutely.
see you, and thank you so much for all your wonderful engagement. We've really enjoyed it.
Goodbye.